Forget the beard. Forget the poison, the bullets, and the icy Neva River. You've been told a fairy tale about a holy devil, a mystic who cast a spell over the Romanovs. It's a lie, and it was a lie manufactured to hide the truth. Grigori Rasputin wasn't a wizard. He was a master psychological predator, a cold, calculating hacker of human trauma who found a structural flaw in an empire and bled it dry. They told you he was a saint. They told you he was a demon. Today, I'm going to tell you the only thing that actually matters, how he broke them. Look at the portraits. Go ahead, take a breath and stare into those painted eyes. You've been told a story about how empires fall. You've been taught that they collapse under the crushing, impersonal weight of economics, the grinding gears of industrialization, or the thunder of marching boots and the righteous fury of starving peasants. You've been trained to look at the grand, gilded tapestry of the Russian court and see a purely political tragedy, a collision of ideologies, a failure of governance, a systemic breakdown of a centuries-old autocracy. What they don't tell you, what the history books, sanitized and bound in leather, refuse to acknowledge, is that an empire can be unraveled by a single, pulsing, exposed nerve. History loves a myth because myths are safe. They turn blood-soaked reality into fable. They paint Grigori Rasputin as a wizard, a dark sorcerer with eyes of fire who cast a hypnotic, supernatural spell over the Romanov family. They make it sound like magic because magic is comforting. It absolves the players of their agency. It suggests the Romanovs were helpless prey to a mystical force, meaning that nobody, not the Tsar, not the ministers, not the generals, could have stopped it. But magic is a lie told by the defeated. Rasputin was no mystic. He was something far more terrifying, a master psychological predator, a hacker. He didn't decode digital algorithms. He decoded the fragile, chaotic architecture of human agony. He didn't break into physical vaults. He infiltrated the deepest, darkest, most fortified corridors of a mother's broken heart. He didn't destroy the Romanovs with sorcery. He used their own terror to corrupt them from within. He didn't build a machine to bring down the state. He found the one component that, if manipulated correctly, would cause the entire system to cascade into failure. And he pulled it. To understand how the infection took hold, you have to understand the cage. Picture the Winter Palace. It is a fortress of gold, marble, and silk. Millions of subjects bow to the Tsar. But inside those massive, echoing walls, the atmosphere isn't royal. It is clinical. It smells of panic, damp linen, stagnant air, and the metallic tang of dried blood. The Romanovs were utterly, agonizingly alone. Tsar Nicholas II was a man drowning in a title too heavy for his shoulders, a man who wanted to be a country gentleman, not a titan of history. But the true epicenter of vulnerability, the bedrock of the system, was the Tsarina Alexandra. She wasn't just isolated. She was a stranger in her own court, suspended in a freezing, hostile vacuum. The Russian nobility despised her German blood. They mocked her stiff posture, her awkwardness, her inability to play the political game. They mistook her crippling, anxiety-fueled social paralysis for imperial arrogance. So, she retreated. She locked the doors. She turned the vast, sprawling palace into a hermetically sealed vault. She created a barrier between her family and the world because the world, in her eyes, was a predator. And then, the universe gave her the nightmare that would crack the glass. Alexei, the long-awaited heir, the boy who carried the future of a 300-year dynasty in his veins. But those veins were broken. Hemophilia. In the early 20th century, that word was a death sentence written in invisible, indelible ink. A single tumble, a bumped knee, a minor cough, and the boy would bleed internally for days. The blood wouldn't stop. It pooled under his skin, stretching it tight, turning his joints into agonizing, swollen lumps of purple, necrotic fire. Imagine the sound. A small child, the future of the nation, screaming in a darkened bedroom, day after day, week after week. Morphine couldn't touch the pain. The doctors could only watch, whispering their useless diagnoses in the hallway, packing the boy in ice, waiting for him to die. And Alexandra sat by that bed. Every sharp cry tore a piece of her sanity away. She didn't just feel maternal grief. She felt catastrophic, crushing guilt. She knew she was the carrier. She had passed the defective, violent gene to her only son. Every drop of blood Alexei spilled was, in her mind, a drop she had spilled herself. The palace was no longer a seat of power. It was a pressure cooker of unexpressed trauma, simmering paranoia, and desperate, feverish religious hysteria. The Romanovs were blind with grief. They were starving for a miracle. And when you are starving, you will swallow poison if it looks like bread. Enter the outsider. Grigori Rasputin did not stumble into St. Petersburg by accident. He smelled the rot from Siberia. He was a man raised in the mud, a wolf who spent decades watching how people beg when they are desperate. He understood a fundamental truth about human nature. A person driven mad by fear does not want an intellectual solution. They want emotional shelter. They want someone to tell them it's going to be okay, and they want that comfort to come from someone who has seen the dirt. When Rasputin first walked into the imperial chambers, he didn't bring theology. He brought an acute, lethal empathy. He looked at the Tsar and saw a weak, malleable man desperate to feel strong, to feel like a real man of the soil. He looked at the Tsarina and saw a mother slowly breaking under the weight of her own guilt. Where the doctors brought cold, sterile science, Rasputin brought warmth. Where the court brought judgment, Rasputin brought absolute, unconditional validation. Think about the sheer, calculating brilliance of his approach. He didn't pretend to be a polished noble. He leaned into the dirt. He kept the mud on his boots. He wore the coarse peasant shirt. Why? Because he knew Alexandra loathed the sophisticated, gossiping courtiers who hated her. By being the anti-courtier, the rugged, authentic, holy man, he instantly became the only person she trusted. He walked into that agonizing room, sat on the edge of the bed, and did what no one else could do. He went quiet. He leaned down, whispered, and touched the boy, and the bleeding stopped. Was it a miracle? No. Modern medicine suggests Rasputin did something simple but devastatingly effective. He ordered the doctors away and told the mother to calm down. In doing so, he stopped the administration of aspirin, which, unknown to science at the time, was an anticoagulant that was actively killing the boy. He lowered the boy's blood pressure and heart rate simply by lowering the room's emotional temperature. But to Alexandra, it was the hand of God. In that exact moment, the breach was complete. Rasputin had found the key to the empire. He had bypassed every guard, every minister, every general. He didn't need an army or a political manifesto. He had a mother's gratitude, which, in the twisted reality of the Romanovs, was far more powerful than any military decree. From that day forward, Rasputin held the dynasty hostage, not with a knife, but with an ultimatum wrapped in a blessing. He made sure Alexandra knew that her son's life was tied directly to his presence. "If I am here, the boy lives," he would whisper, the phantom of a threat always hanging in the air. "If I leave, he dies." Can you feel the weight of that psychological vice? It is the ultimate exploit. He turned a mother's fiercest instinct, the desire to protect her child, into the weapon that would execute her family. The official history tells you that Russia fell because of political incompetence. They show you documents of state dumas, talk about ministerial changes, and analyze the failures of the First World War. But peer into the shadows. Every time Nicholas tried to exile Rasputin, every time the government ministers begged the Tsar to send the dirty peasant away for the sake of the country's dignity, Alexandra would spiral into hysteria. She would see her son's blood on the floor. She would scream that the entire world was trying to kill her child. And Nicholas, broken, exhausted, and terrified of his own wife's grief, would yield. "It is not a matter of politics," she would argue, her eyes wide with the terror of a mother who has lived through 100 deaths. "It is a matter of life. You choose the state, then you choose to kill my boy." Rasputin didn't just enter the palace. He became the filter through which the rulers of Russia saw reality. He isolated them further, cutting away anyone who spoke the truth and replacing them with puppets who flattered his ego and feared his wrath. He created a feedback loop of destruction. 1. Isolate the target from rational advisors. 2. Reinforce the fear of the outside world. 3. Tie the target's survival to the manipulator's presence. 4. Let the system decay from the inside while you hold the keys. In 1914, the world caught fire. World War I broke out, and the Russian Empire was dragged into a meat grinder. Millions of Russian soldiers were slaughtered on the Eastern Front. The economy collapsed, inflation soared, and the cities began to starve. The infrastructure was running at maximum capacity, overclogged and overheating. And then, in 1915, Tsar Nicholas II made a fatal mistake. Driven by a desperate need to project strength, he left St. Petersburg to take personal command of the army at the front lines. He left the home front, the nerve center of the empire, completely unattended. Or rather, he left it in the hands of Alexandra, which means he left it in the hands of Rasputin. This was the ultimate seizure of power. Rasputin was no longer just a ghost in the palace corridors. He was running the administrative core of the state. From 1915 to 1916, St. Petersburg devolved into absolute, hallucinatory madness. Alexandra, utterly dependent on our friend, as she called him, wouldn't appoint a single official without his clearance. Rasputin began rewriting the cabinet. Competent ministers, experienced generals, and brilliant economic minds were discarded overnight simply because they refused to bow to a Siberian peasant. In their place, he installed incompetent sycophants and thieves who bought their way into office. The Russian government became a revolving door of chaos. In just over a year, Russia went through 4 prime ministers, 5 ministers of the interior, and 3 ministers of war. It was administrative whiplash. While millions of soldiers froze in the trenches without ammunition or boots, the capital was being governed by a man who spent his nights drinking in taverns and his days dictating military strategy based on vivid dreams he had the night before. Letters from Alexandra to Nicholas at the front reveal the terrifying depth of the infection. She wrote to her husband, pleading with him to follow Rasputin's visions. "Our friend begs you to order an advance near Riga. He says it is absolutely necessary." Think about that. The military movements of an empire commanding millions of lives were being decided by the erratic, alcohol-fueled impulses of a man who couldn't even read a military map. The public didn't see a tragedy. They saw a treasonous conspiracy. Whispers turned into screams in the streets. Cartoons depicted Rasputin as a giant puppet master, holding the imperial couple in his soiled hands. The legitimacy of the 300-year-old dynasty didn't just erode, it evaporated. By late 1916, the system was crashing. The nobility realized that if Rasputin wasn't removed from the equation, the entire empire would plunge into an abyss. A group of aristocratic conspirators, led by the ultra-wealthy Prince Felix Yusupov, decided to manually purge the threat. What followed is the legendary, paranoid climax of the Grand Illusion. On a freezing December night, Yusupov invited Rasputin to his palace under the pretense of a party. In the basement, they fed him cakes and wine laced with enough potassium cyanide to kill a small army. And here is where history slips back into the comfortable lie of magic. The myth says Rasputin ate the poison and smiled, completely unaffected because he was a demon. It says he was shot multiple times, drowned in an icy river, and still tried to claw his way out. But science and forensics tell a colder, cleaner story. The poison likely never entered his system properly. either because the cyanide had degraded into harmless compounds due to improper storage, or because the panic conspirators failed to lace the food correctly. Rasputin wasn't a supernatural monster who couldn't die. He was a desperate man trapped in a basement with killers. When the poison failed, Yusupov panicked and shot him in the chest. Rasputin collapsed, but as the conspirators celebrated, the body stirred. Fueled by pure adrenaline and the primal instinct to survive, he lunged at Yusupov, broke free, and stumbled out into the snow-covered courtyard. The conspirators chased him down like a wounded animal, firing into the dark. A final bullet struck him in the forehead, dropping him into the snow. They bound his body and dumped it into the frozen Neva River. They thought that by removing the virus, they could save the operating system. But they were too late. The damage was structural. Rasputin had already corrupted the foundational files. He had hollowed out the Romanovs' authority so completely that when he died, there was nothing left to hold up the ceiling. Before his death, Rasputin allegedly sent a prophetic warning to the Tsar. He told Nicholas that if he were killed by commoners, the dynasty would survive. But if he were killed by the nobility, by the Tsar's own blood, no member of the imperial family would be left alive within 2 years. It wasn't a prophecy from God. It was a flawless calculation from a master behavioral analyst. Rasputin knew that if the nobility resorted to murdering a peasant to save the state, it meant the entire social order was already fractured beyond repair. 10 weeks after Rasputin's body was pulled from the ice, the Russian Revolution erupted. Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. Less than a year after that, the entire family, Nicholas, Alexandra, and the children, were led down into a dark basement in Siberia and executed by firing squad. The common narrative says he was a holy man who lost his way. What they don't tell you is that he was a parasite who found the perfect golden host. He found a family locked in a glass cage of grief, and instead of breaking them out, he climbed inside and broke the glass from the core, letting the cold air of history rush in to freeze them to death. He was never a mystic. He was just a man who knew exactly how much pain a human could take before they started begging for a savior. And he was the only one holding the knife. What they don't tell you is simpler, sweatier, far more terrifying. Grigori Rasputin did not use magic. He used a weapon much more reliable, much more lethal. He used the human heart against itself. He was not a sorcerer. He was a systematic hacker of grief. An emotional engineer who walked into a house of mourning and systematically rewired its security systems until the inhabitants were entirely at his mercy. Look at this layout. Imagine the Alexander Palace not as a monument of gold and marble, but as a sealed, suffocating vault. To dismantle an empire, you do not begin by attacking its walls. You find the single, raw nerve of its rulers and you press until they scream. For the Romanovs, that nerve was a child who could bleed to death from a simple stumble, a bruise, or a cough. Alexei's hemophilia was the state's deepest, most pathological secret. The public was told nothing. The nobility was kept at a distance. And in that enforced silence, a vacuum of absolute terror grew. Rasputin smelled that terror from thousands of miles away in the Siberian wilderness. If you look at the letters recovered from the Tsarina's private chambers, letters the Bolsheviks later pulled from blood-stained drawers in the Ipatov house, the strategy becomes sickeningly clear. Rasputin did not force his way into the palace. He made the world outside feel so hostile, so venomous, that Alexandra herself locked the doors from the inside and handed him the keys. He began with a whisper. Let's look at case file entry 104 from the internal palace logs dated winter 1907. It records his first prolonged private audience with the Empress. He didn't speak of theology. He didn't quote complex scripture. He leaned in close, exhaling the scent of cheap tobacco and unwashed wool, and said, "They do not understand your suffering, little mother. They look at your son and they see a broken crown. They see an unstable throne. Only I see his soul. Only I feel the tearing in your womb when he weeps. Notice the phrasing. It is deliberate. It is an engineering marvel of emotional abuse. In those few words, he accomplished three things simultaneously. He validated her agonizing, sleepless terror, making her feel seen for the first time in an alien, hostile Russian court that had always rejected her German roots. He turned the entire Russian aristocracy into cold, unfeeling monsters who supposedly crave her child's demise. He positioned himself as her only emotional life support system, the sole bridge between her dying boy and a merciful God. The pacing of the palace shifted almost immediately after that meeting. The high-born ladies-in-waiting, the Grand Dukes, the lifelong trusted advisors who had served the Romanovs for decades. One by one, they were systematically branded by Alexandra as doubters, traitors, or enemies of the Holy Spirit. If an advisor warned the Empress to be cautious of the peasant, Rasputin would simply tell her that the devil was speaking through that advisor's mouth to sever her link to God's protection. Let's examine the secret police files from the Okhrana, the Tsar's own elite intelligence service. Their agents were stationed outside Rasputin's apartment on Gorkovaya Street 24 hours a day. They logged every visitor, every crate of expensive wine, every late-night tryst with high society women who traded their dignity for a blessing. They compiled these files into thick, leather-bound dossiers. They brought these files directly to the Tsar. They laid out the raw, ugly truth of this man's predatory debauchery on heavy oak tables in the imperial study. And what did Nicholas do? He burned them. He literally threw the intelligence reports of his own state apparatus into the fireplace. Why? Because Rasputin had already preemptively installed a psychological firewall in the Tsar's mind. Months earlier, he had told Nicholas, "The devil is furious that the Lord has given you a true friend from the soil. The aristocrats hate me because I am a peasant. They will use your own spies to manufacture lies about me. When they bring you filth about my name, know that it is Christ they are mocking through me." Think about the psychological trap. The more evidence brought against Rasputin, the more it proved Rasputin's own prophecy. The evidence of his guilt became, in the warped minds of the imperial couple, the ultimate proof of his holiness. To the Tsar, an official police report wasn't proof of a predator's crimes. It was proof of a holy man's martyrdom. He didn't just hijack the Empress's grief. He hijacked the Tsar's faith and turned it into an unassailable shield. He made it so that to doubt Rasputin was to doubt God himself. And for a Tsar who believed his power was granted by divine right, doubting God was an impossibility. The isolation was complete. The rulers of the largest empire on earth were now locked in a dark room of their own making, listening only to the breathing of a peasant from Pokrovskoy. When the grandees of the court, terrified for the survival of the monarchy, begged Alexandra on their knees to dismiss him for the sake of the family's reputation, her reaction was precisely what Rasputin had engineered. She didn't see a reputational crisis. She saw a saint being crucified by a wicked, godless, decadent society. She saw herself and Rasputin as figures in a biblical narrative of persecution. The document that changed everything was an intercepted letter from Alexandra to Rasputin, stolen by a dynamic political rival and leaked to the press. It read, "My beloved teacher, my comforter, how weary I am without you. My soul is only at peace, my eyes only close in sleep. When you, my mystic guide, rest your head upon my shoulder and bless my exhausted heart." To the public, this was an explicit, scandalous proof of an illicit affair. To a clinical eye, to someone who understands the architecture of psychological capture, it is something far more tragic. It is the sound of a woman drowning in a dark room, reaching out for the hand of the very man who is holding her head underwater. He fed her paranoia daily. Every newspaper article condemning him was used as ammunition. Every speech in the Duma, denouncing his influence was brought to her as a badge of honor. He twisted every criticism of his character into an indirect attack on her dying son. "If I leave your side," he warned her over and over, his voice dropping to an ominous, rhythmic chant. "The boy dies within 24 hours. If I am cast out by your jealous nobles, the Romanov dynasty will fall within 6 months and the crown will be crushed in the dirt." It wasn't a prophecy. It was a hostage negotiation. He was holding the life of the heir to the throne over her head like an axe. He forced her to choose between the political survival of the Russian Empire and the physical survival of her only son. And a mother will choose her child every single time, even if she has to burn an empire to keep him warm. Let's look at the mechanics of the kitchen cabinet. By the summer of 1915, the disaster reached its tipping point. Nicholas, in an act of monumental political folly, left St. Petersburg to take personal command of the army on the front lines of World War I. He left Alexandra in absolute, unchecked control of the domestic government, and who stood directly behind her chair, whispering into her ear. The letters between the Tsar and Tsarina during this specific period read like a slow-motion train wreck, an agonizing record of a state's administrative system being gutted by a parasite. Look at the ink on these pages. Our friend suggests you move the troops near Riga. He had a dream that the victory lies there. Our friend says the Minister of Interior is a bad, disloyal man. You must replace him immediately with someone who loves us. Our friend had a vision last night that the bread supply in the capital will fix itself if we remove the current governor and appoint his associate. This was not spiritual guidance. This was an extraction of state authority. This was a hostile takeover of a superpower's executive branch. Rasputin was not reading the stars or receiving messages from heaven. He was reading the room. He targeted the weak, the ambitious, the deeply corrupt politicians who knew that the only path to the Tsar's ear was through the peasant's dirty, crowded apartment. He traded political appointments for absolute, groveling devotion. Consider Boris Sturmer, an incompetent, widely despised, and borderline senile bureaucrat who was suddenly elevated to prime minister simply because Rasputin found him compliant and easy to manage. Then came Alexander Protopopov, a man showing clear, advanced signs of mental instability and syphilitic dementia, who was made Minister of the Interior, controlling the entire domestic police and food distribution network, because he wept at Rasputin's feet and claimed to see a halo around the peasant's head. The empire was bleeding out on the battlefields of Europe. Millions of young Russian men were rotting in the frozen mud of the Eastern Front, starving, without boots, without ammunition. And the levers of power back in the capital were being pulled by an emotional predator who couldn't even read a basic military map. You can see the cold calculation in how he handled the Tsar's rare moments of backbone. Whenever Nicholas, in a brief flash of clarity, tried to assert his authority, whenever he threatened to send Rasputin back to his village under military escort, the boy Alexei would suddenly, violently, experience a new episode of internal bleeding. A minor fall in the garden, a slight slip while sitting at a desk, a sudden, agonizing swelling in the pelvis or the knee. The palace would immediately plunge into a state of hysterical panic. Telegraphs would fly across the vast expanses of Russia. Alexandra would fall to her knees, screaming at her husband that he was killing their son with his stubbornness. Rasputin would stay in his apartment, wait for the desperation to reach its absolute peak, and then send a short, terse telegram. The Lord has seen your tears. Do not fear. The illness is conquered. The boy will live. And miraculously, within 24 hours of the telegram's arrival, the bleeding would stop. Modern medical science now tells us the grim, clinical reality of what was actually happening. The court doctors, frantic with anxiety and completely out of their depth, were dosing the young prince with aspirin, a newly marketed wonder drug from Germany. But aspirin is a potent blood thinner. It was actively preventing the boy's blood from clotting, keeping his internal wounds open, killing him slowly from the inside out. Rasputin, with his peasant distrust of Western medicine and his desire to remove any competing authority figures, ordered the doctors away from the bedside and forbade them from giving the boy any more pills. He didn't heal the boy with holy energy. He accidentally stopped the medical poisoning, but he didn't tell them that. He let them believe his voice was the only thing standing between the heir to the throne and the cold earth of the graveyard. He held the entire royal family, and by extension the entire Russian state, hostage using the biological flaw of a little boy's DNA. He turned a medical tragedy into a political monopoly. This is the crime scene. By the bitter, freezing winter of 1916, the air in Petrograd was thick with the smell of coal smoke, cheap cabbage, and impending doom. The people were standing in bread lines for 12 hours in sub-zero temperatures, their breath freezing in the air, their hatred hardening into fury. The soldiers of the front lines were deserting by the tens of thousands, throwing their rifles into the snow and walking home. And inside the isolated Alexander Palace, the psychological quarantine was complete. If you read the diary entries of the Grand Duchesses, the Tsar's young daughters, during these final months, the atmosphere is suffocatingly cult-like. They weren't living like the royalty of a modern European nation. They were living like prisoners of an emotional captor. They wore silk amulets around their necks, containing Rasputin's hair and small, hand-painted icons of his face next to their skin. They spent their evenings not attending state functions or diplomatic dinners, but sitting on the floor around him, listening to him ramble about the purity of the soil and the wickedness of the city. They had been entirely, systematically disconnected from reality. Rasputin had achieved the ultimate, definitive goal of the psychological predator. He had made his victims completely dependent on their own ongoing destruction. He had systematically dismantled the legitimacy, the respect, and the foundational stability of a 300-year-old dynasty, not with revolutionary bombs, not with political speeches, but by exploiting a mother's broken heart and a father's religious guilt. The Grand Duchess and the old nobility realized far too late that you cannot reason with an imperial system that has been sabotaged from the inside out. The letters from Grand Duke Nikolai Mihailovich to the Tsar during these final, breathless weeks before the end are a desperate, terrified scream. You are blind, Nicky. You are listening to a peasant who is leading Russia to the abyss. Your ministers are his creatures. Your court is a joke. For the love of God, for the love of your country, open your eyes before it is too late. But Nicholas couldn't see. The psychological firewall was absolute. The Tsar looked at his cousin's letter and saw only another manifestation of the noble conspiracy that Rasputin had warned him about years ago. The crime was already complete. The empire was already dead. It just hadn't fallen over yet. The man from Siberia had peeled away every layer of defense, every shred of institutional loyalty, every ounce of traditional respect the Russian people had held for their sovereign. He had left the Romanovs naked, shivering, stripped of their mystique, and completely alone in the direct path of an oncoming, unstoppable revolution. When a small group of desperate aristocrats finally dragged him into a basement in December 1916 to poison, shoot, and drown him, they thought they were saving the monarchy. They didn't realize they were performing an autopsy on a corpse. They didn't kill him because he was a mystic. They killed him because they finally realized what he really was. A parasite that had eaten the brain of the Russian Empire from within, leaving behind only a hollow, twitching, doomed shell ready to be swept away by the storm. You've been told the story ends in the frozen waters of the Malaya, Nevka River. Poisoned, shot, beaten, and drowned. You've been told that when they pulled his waterlogged, lacerated corpse from the black ice, the monster was finally dead and the nightmare of the Russian Empire was over. What they don't tell you is that Grigori Rasputin never actually left the room. We comfort ourselves by treating him as a historical aberration. A bizarre, one-off anomaly wearing filthy peasant robes, trapped forever in the antique amber of 1916. We point at the Romanovs from the safe distance of a century and mock their desperation. How could an emperor ruling over 1/6 of the entire globe succumb to an illiterate mystic from the Siberian wilderness? How could a brilliant German-born empress let a holy man dictate the shifting of ministers and the deployment of armies during a total war? It is a comforting, protective lie. It shields us from a devastating reality. Nicholas and Alexandra were not stupid. They were human. They were terrified parents sitting in the suffocating dark of an isolated palace, watching their hemophiliac son, their only heir, bleed to death from the inside out. Every stumble, every bruise was a death sentence. Rasputin did not use ancient magic or hypnotic spells to open their guarded palace gates. He used something far more dangerous, far more modern: targeted emotional leverage. He mapped the exact topography of their grief. He located the deepest, most agonizing structural fracture in their psychology and inserted himself directly into the wound. He didn't break their defense systems. He became the only thing that made them feel safe. He completely possessed them. This was not a historical event. It was a successful, terrifying proof of concept. Look around you today. The grease-stained peasant robes have been traded for tailored Italian suits, clean-cut tech aesthetics, and sleek algorithmic interfaces. But the underlying code, the exploit used to breach the human mind, remains exactly the same. The modern world is entirely engineered by digital Rasputins. Consider how power is manipulated in the 21st century. The old world dictators relied on raw, brute force, on iron, boots, barbed wire, and blood. The New World predators rely on weaponized intimacy. They operate exactly like the Siberian peasant. They don't storm your fortress, they find a grievance. They isolate your specific, private anxiety, your fear of economic ruin, your cultural displacement, your paralyzing loneliness, your desperate desire for relevance. And they tell you exactly what Rasputin whispered to the Empress. Only I can keep the boy alive. Only I can cure the pain. Everyone outside these walls is lying to you. When an internet influencer builds a fierce parasocial bond with millions of isolated teenagers, convincing them that they alone understand their pain, that is the Rasputin hack. When a political demagogue bypasses traditional institutions, journalists, and objective facts to speak directly to the raw, unvarnished resentment of a crowd, that is the Rasputin hack. When an algorithm analyzes your search history, maps your emotional vulnerabilities, and feeds you a steady, weaponized diet of outrage to keep your eyes glued to a screen, you are sitting in the dark with the holy man. We live in a hyper-connected ecosystem explicitly designed to exploit human vulnerability at scale. Rasputin had to do it face-to-face, reading the micro-expressions of a desperate mother in a candlelit room. Today, data brokers and neural networks do it simultaneously to 3 billion people every single second. They know when you're lonely. They know when you're angry. They know when you're bleeding. And just like the monk from Pokrovskoye, they walk right through your locked doors without ever throwing a single punch. It collapsed from the core downward because its fundamental software was corrupted by a single, brilliant psychological predator who realized that human feelings are just data waiting to be weaponized. We look back at the ruins of the Russian Empire and wonder how they could have been so blind. We assure ourselves that we are smarter, more evolved, more digital, and completely immune to the primitive tricks of a long-dead peasant. But ask yourself this before the screen goes black. Right now, in this very moment, who is holding your hand in the dark? Who is whispering exactly what you want to hear to soothe your deepest fears? And whose empire are you silently tearing down just to keep them close? You think you're the viewer watching a documentary about a historical ghost. What if you are the one currently sitting in the palace, watching your own world bleed, completely blind to the monster already standing at the foot of your bed? The past isn't dead. It's just learned how to code. If you want to survive the dark history they try to hide from you, you need to know how the hackers operate. Hit subscribe. Don't let them catch you in the dark.